Hi, everyone. This is Doug Hubbard. It's great to be talking at Risk Awareness Week again. Today, I'm going to talk about something I've been calling integrated decision management. In previous Risk Awareness Week events, I talked about things like problems with popular qualitative risk assessment methods. I talked about the advantages of certain quantitative methods and why it's important to train your subject matter experts to be better at subjectively assessing probabilities. I've also talked about simple empirical methods and some new simulation techniques. I've been applying methods like these in a variety of practical problems over the years. Sometimes it's within the context of risk management alone, but often that is just part of the solution. Risk informs decisions, but it's not the only part of decision making. That's because the entire world of decision-making methods includes a lot of things that typically are not within risk management, the way that most people practice it. And because of that, risk management is disconnected from these processes and methods. Having said that, the problem isn't just with risk management, it's with everything that's supposed to support decisions. I'll be talking about all of that. I'll illustrate this disconnect between risk management and decision-making in general by talking about a few questions that tend to come up in risk management-related workshops that I have with clients. You probably run into these issues too. One question would be, how big does a risk have to be a risk? How much does it have to cost, and how uncertain does it have to be to constitute a risk? Salaries are very costly. That's a big part of the expense of a lot of firms, just the salaries of everyone. And it's a little bit uncertain because you have turnover every year, you have new hires every year. So how much uncertainty about a cost like that would constitute a risk? Where's the threshold? Here's another question that's come up during workshops like this. I've heard someone propose that not meeting some goal in sales is a risk. Sometimes it's a very ambitious goal. So if you just make the goal more ambitious, does that make the risk higher? There's not even a loss involved in that case. If you fall short of an ambitious goal in sales, you still made a lot of money. Is that still a risk? And finally, where do we assess how much more risk is acceptable given a higher return? That doesn't even really come up in risk management typically. The answer to the first three questions is generally just a policy statement. An organization will say, well, here's how big a risk is according to my definition. Here's how uncertain it has to be. It has to be at least a $100,000 loss or $1 million loss. It has to be something that's less likely than 80% a year, or uncertain enough that we can't just budget for it every year like Walmart would do with shoplifting or something like that. Questions like these are what separates risk management from decision making in general. Now, some definitions of risk confuse risk and opportunity. So someone might think that falling short of a sales goal is a risk because they think of risk as including uncertainty about a return as well, just the uncertainty about a goal. There could be what they might call upside risk. You see, decisions include decisions under uncertainty, which include risk and opportunity. We have uncertainty about both gains and losses. There's different terms for those different things. We don't have to conflate them. As I said, sometimes people want to define risk as including uncertainty about gains, but there's already different words for this. If you want to talk about the chance of a loss and the chance of a gain, you can just use the term uncertainty. That covers both of them. If you want to talk about uncertainty about a benefit, we're going to use the term opportunity. And if we want uncertainty about a loss, we're going to use the term risk. That's actually more compatible with the way it's used in quantitative methods and the English definition of the word. So that's the way I'm going to continue to use it. So risk and opportunity are just part of decisions under uncertainty. Those are part of decisions. The other part of decisions being decisions where there's perfect information. That actually is a whole category of decision making. It's not one we're going to tend to focus on. It tends not to be a realistic representation of a lot of practical business decisions. You can have lots of certainty. You could have even perfect information about some decisions, but the decision is so complex that you still have to do a lot of analysis on it. So there's no question about the accuracy of the information in the decision at that point. It's just the complexity of the problem. So in a way, I kind of think of having risk management separate from decisions under uncertainty makes about as much sense as a left foot shoe department. They go together. You have risk and you have opportunity. You have a whole field called decisions under uncertainty. It's actually part of several methods that are out there that are typically not part of the toolbox that you tend to see people use in risk management. So let's think of risk management, which includes risk analysis, as part of a larger ecosystem of decision making. It's part of and overlaps with decision analysis and various optimization methods. I won't go into great detail talking about portfolio theory or options theory. Those are all part of decision analysis methods, though. There is a whole field called specifically decision analysis, which includes risk assessments. That's part of it. We also need to include modeling methods and even decision psychology. Those are parts of the methods used in risk management and other areas of decision making. Also, empirical methods and monitoring things, all those dashboards and metrics and so forth, and just Bayesian update methods for reducing your uncertainty. Those are part of risk management, risk analysis, and part of decision making in general. But if I were to try to encapsulate all of these different concepts and many more under one cohesive idea, I might call it integrated decision management. That's what we've been talking about, is bringing all of these things together. So I'm not talking just about trying to integrate risk management with decision making in general, but really trying to integrate all these other parts of decision making. Risk management's not the only outlier out there. There's lots of loose pieces, lots of car parts on the garage floor, as I tell my staff, regarding how people make decisions. Now, here's an issue that comes up in typical decision analysis problems, but it's usually not part of what we normally consider risk management. Often our clients are asking us to prioritize a list of investment ideas. These could be R&D investments in aerospace or pharmaceuticals or even entertainment projects or large IT projects. Those are lots of different choices that people could make. They've got limited resources. They've got to decide where to put their money. How much risk is justified by a high return? Which of these investments should be selected or rejected? And which ones are higher priority? Which of them have a better risk-return position? Risk management by itself doesn't actually answer these questions. It's not about how we should select and prioritize investments, how we should track their performance, or about the methods used to make those decisions. In order to even answer questions like that, we have to state how risk-averse we are. How much risk are we willing to accept for a given return? That's not a question that actually comes up in most risk assessment methods, even quantitative ones. But that is something that comes up in typical portfolio prioritization methods like the ones I referred to. The problem is that our risk aversion is something that changes subconsciously and daily. We're not even aware that sometimes we're just more risk averse than others. Experiments have been done that show that relatively arbitrary external irrelevant factors actually changed the risk aversion of people who play games of chance. For example, in one controlled experiment, people might play a game of chance on a computer where one group is exposed to smiling faces on the background images of the computer screens where they're playing the game. And another group is just exposed to white screens in the background of the game, kind of like these slides you're looking at right now. The group that's exposed to smiling faces is consistently more risk tolerant. They take higher risk, higher return bets than the group that doesn't have exposure to those smiling faces. Similar experiments have been done where people were asked to recall an event in their life when they were angry or afraid, and then they would subsequently play this game of chance, and the anger group would be more risk tolerant and the fear group would be more risk averse. As I said, these change every day. If you don't explicitly state your risk aversion, you're just going to be more risk averse on Tuesday morning than you were Thursday afternoon, and that was the reason you made the decision you made. So one way we've been quantifying our risk tolerance is to use this tool here that we're showing in this chart called a loss exceedance curve. This curve is a mathematically unambiguous way of expressing the risk that I have in a system. It shows the probability of losing more than X in a given period of time. The horizontal axis here is the log scale of a loss, and the vertical axis is the chance per year of losing more than that amount. In this particular curve in a hypothetical organization, we're showing a 40% chance of losing more than $10 million in a given year and a 10% chance of losing more than $200 million in a given year. Now, what we might do is just refer to this as an inherent risk curve. This is our current state of risk before we apply other discretionary controls and mitigations. After we apply those controls and mitigations, we hope to get a lower risk curve. We'll call that the residual risk curve. And if I want to ask, is that low enough? I can answer that by specifying a risk appetite curve. I can say, here's a curve I want to be lower than. It's just a matter of policy. We just state it as a policy statement at the board of directors level or some C level, and that's just an arbitrary way of saying anything above this is too much risk. At least it's mathematically unambiguous, but it doesn't actually help us answer the question about risk-return trade-offs. This by itself doesn't tell us how much more risk am I willing to accept if the return were higher. In order to do that, I actually have to introduce something called utility theory. That's where we can get very explicit about risk-return trade-offs in a rational way. Expected utility theory is a very quantitatively, mathematically well-founded way of describing risk preferences. It's been part of game theory and decision theory for many decades now. It was expounded upon in great detail in The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. They got very mathematical, as you can imagine. But it's kind of interesting that there's this whole field of mathematics about how to be internally rational given preferences. You can even be mathematical about your preferences. Your preferences can be internally irrational, and there's ways that you can test whether or not preferences are internally irrational. It turns out that only certain categories of utility functions express a rational risk-return trade-off. I won't get into great detail about that, but this is not pure academics in theory. This is stuff that we actually use on projects. Lots of people use these things. We didn't invent these methods. They've been around for decades, and it's a practical part of decision-making in many fields. So how do we apply those theories to a practical problem like evaluating a set of investments where there's different uncertain risk and return? Okay, here's 4 investments again, A, B, C, and D. Now, if I look at these, you can tell that D is definitely preferable to A. D has a higher average return and lower risk than A. You would never select A over D, it seems. Okay, but how about B and C? B has the potential of very large returns, but it's also got some risk to it. C has apparently no risk, but a small return. Which one do you prefer? Well, there's no single right answer there. That's a function of your risk tolerance. What you need to do, though, is state your risk tolerance in a mathematically unambiguous way so we could always tell if you were perfectly consistent and weren't influenced by all those random external irrelevant factors. You would always give the same answer when you're presented this kind of a question. Okay? Well, one way that we can answer this question is convert all of these distributions into a single number and compare all these investments based on the single number. That single number could be the certain monetary equivalent. That's a certain monetary amount you consider equivalent to this uncertain distribution. If, for example, in investment B, you'd be indifferent between accepting that investment if you thought it was a viable investment, something that you would prefer to invest in, but instead you were also given the choice of cash in hand of a certain amount, how much cash in hand would you be willing to take such that you would be just about exactly indifferent between that cash in hand and accepting investment B? That's your certain monetary equivalent. We can figure out what your certain monetary equivalents are by asking just a few examples of some hypothetical bets that you would accept or not. If you had a 60% chance of winning 10 million and a 40% chance of losing some amount, how much of a loss would you be willing to accept to make that bet acceptable to you? Would you accept a 60% chance of winning 10 million and a 40% chance of a $2 million loss? How about a $4 million loss, etc.? There is an amount that you would be indifferent on. Some people would say, I would be indifferent between a 60% chance of winning 10 million and a 40% chance of a $10,000 loss because they're so risk averse. That's not a wrong answer. That's just an extremely risk averse person, right? The important thing is if we can just get the answer to a few equivalent bet questions like that, then we can figure out your utility function. And we can figure out your certain monetary equivalent if you're perfectly consistent and not influenced by all those random irrelevant factors every day. We can apply that to each of these investments and we can always prioritize them with your perfectly consistent risk aversion. I should point out that risk management is not the only method that needs to be integrated with decision management. Decision management needs to be integrated with itself. There's a lot of different components floating around that are all part of what's supposed to help make decisions better. Risk management, dashboards, data science, training of subject matter experts, performance metrics, decision quality, finance and accounting, machine learning, methods for prioritizing projects, etc. All of these and a lot more, I can't bother to list, are supposed to contribute to better decision making, better returns on investment, better accomplishment of the mission for the organization. But how do we bring all of these together? They all have proponents. Each one of these I've heard lots of buzz about, and many more items, by the way. And some of the most buzzworthy things have changed a lot over the years. I haven't heard as much about option theory lately, but it was a big thing at one point in time. Likewise, portfolio theory and lots of other methods, operations research, that's even a World War II method, but even artificial intelligence and so forth. Those are kind of buzzwordy things that are all supposed to help businesses make better decisions. So how do we decide what works? I realize there's a lot of advocates of every one of these methods, but we can't really just go by our perception that they're working. Now, if you've seen me talk before, you might have seen me talk about the analysis placebo. I'll mention it again just very briefly, but there's been research in a lot of different fields that indicate that if somebody adopts a methodology that seems more structured and formal, they will inevitably feel more confident in their estimates and decisions. This has been tested in applying methods for forecasting the outcomes of horse races and sporting events, the performance of investment portfolios, the durations of projects, and so forth. In each of these very different areas, confidence always went up when people collaborated in a more structured way or used what seemed like some structured estimation method. But the confidence went up even when the measured performance was no better or got worse. So we call this the analysis placebo. We can't just pretend that our perception of efficacy is going to mean that a method is effective. We actually have to measure it. We have to test these things. One way we can test them, something I rely on quite a bit, is looking at what research says about the performance of different methods that we're using. So if I look at the research, and there's lots of research that points in the same direction, large clinical trials find the same things, well, then I have a little bit more confidence in that method. But I don't have a lot of confidence in testimonials or best practices, etc., because everyone can fool themselves. All right. Well, here's an example of one of those things that I just mentioned, the typical dashboard. You've probably seen some of these things. These are also supposed to help inform decisions. People are supposed to make better decisions with dashboards like these. They're very busy looking. They have some nice colors on them. They look like they should be informative. But how do we know we're actually better at making decisions with them? And the kinds of projects I worked on, the clients that use dashboards generally didn't come up with a rational way to select what should even be on the dashboard in the first place. They sort of had a wish list. They believed that if they knew these things, they hoped they would be better at making certain kinds of decisions. Well, hope is not a strategy. Sometimes I think the strategy is to wait for a kind of dashboard epiphany, that if you have all these charts and graphs and quantities reported on a dashboard and it updates daily, that just by looking at it, you'll have some revelation. You'll observe some combination of factors and outcomes. You'll do this math in your head and figure it's time for executing initiative X because just the right combination of factors have arisen. Well, you don't really know what thresholds or trigger conditions you're looking for. You presumably have a set of decisions that you're trying to inform here, but you haven't worked out in advance what the conditions are on the dashboard that would lead you to a particular decision. If you do that, we call that a decision-driven dashboard. All right, that's preferable to just a dashboard where the strategy is to hope that you observe some phenomenon that's occurring. Also, how did we even figure out what should be on that dashboard in the first place? As I said, usually people just select things to be on the dashboard because they believe they'll feel better if they just see that information. But as you might have seen me talk about before as well, we're not very good at guessing what we should be measuring. Fortunately, there is a way we can work out what we should be measuring, what we should be reporting on things like dashboards. For quite a few decades now, there's been methods for computing the expected value of information. This value of information approach to deciding what to measure has been around really since World War II. We've been applying it systematically to every major decision analysis project we've been on. We build these models that might have a couple of dozen variables to more than 300 variables, and a lot of them will be highly uncertain, represented by probability distributions, and we're running Monte-Carlo simulations on them. We run this information value calculation to work out the monetary value of measuring each and every variable in the entire model. We tend to find out that relatively few things in a big uncertain decision require further measurement. That's one useful finding by itself. But we also tend to find out that the high value measurements are not what the client would have measured otherwise. There systematically seems to be a preference for measuring things that on average have lower information value for decisions. That is, measuring them is statistically less likely to actually inform the decision, to cause you to make a better strategic choice about that decision. I call this the measurement inversion because it's popped up in every industry we've ever looked in. There seems to be a systematic preference for measuring things which are lower information value than other things. This measurement inversion, it's been observed since I started doing this at least 20 years ago. I don't know how it doesn't affect the GDP. But it is the basis that you could use for determining what should even go on a dashboard in the first place. You work out your decisions in advance, these decisions that you're hoping will just come to you without this planning in advance. You specify these decisions, and by specifying those decisions and modeling the impact of different measurements on those decisions, you can figure out what you really should be tracking. It might be a combination of 3 or 4 subtle relationships among variables that would be very hard to detect if you were just observing them casually. In fact, even if you detected them at all, it might be highly delayed and maybe you would have waited too long to make the decision. It really is too hard for even people familiar with the simulation that they built, the decision model that they built, to try to do in their heads. So you need to do that math more dynamically in real time. All right, here's some other things that we can measure, though. Remember, we're thinking of decision making as part of a large ecosystem of methods. We have models, we have decision makers, we have subject matter experts who are providing estimates, and we have all the conditions under which they work and the information which is shown to them for making their decisions. Well, some of the things that we can measure the performance of regarding human experts are things like noise. There's been quite a lot written about this over the years. There's been a lot of research showing that we're highly inconsistent in our estimates and decisions. But some of that same research also shows that we can reduce that inconsistency mathematically. This is a method that's been around since the 1950s called the lens method. We use it all the time, just like everything else I've talked about here, we've used in the real world. There's another thing I'm getting to later on that we haven't yet used, an aspirational goal, but I'll get to that point. Everything I've mentioned so far is something that we've actually used in the real world. What we can do is track the decisions and or estimates of a number of subject matter experts in a given field, and we try to build a model that predicts their judgments. The model of their judgments, oddly enough, is actually better than their original judgments. The reason is there's just a lot of inconsistency. There's a lot of noise in their judgment and decision making. In every field where this method has been applied since the 1950s, it shows a reduction in expert judgment error. Cancer patient recovery times, the failure rates of small businesses. I've applied it to battlefield fuel forecast, predicting how much money new movies are going to make, IT risk, and lots of other areas, how long projects will take, etc. There's actually been a more popular book written recently on this. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, wrote the book Noise. I've cited him a lot on some other research, actually, but he's recently written this book, which finally cites a study that is pretty obscure that I've been citing for a long time, and now I can finally refer people to a more popular book that's more recent than these ancient studies. So measuring expert inconsistency is actually something we can measure as part of integrated decision making because they're a component in integrated decision making. Another thing we could track if we had a dashboard of performance in decision-making processes is the performance of individual experts at calibration. Now, you may have seen me talk before about calibrated probability assessment training, so I won't spend too much time on that. But the bottom line is people can be trained to be better at probabilistically assessing their own uncertainty. It's a skill you can learn, we can measure it, and you can get better at it. And without that training, we know that people are generally pretty bad at it. There's also been a lot of interesting research showing that there's conditions under which those individuals can work better. We know what kind of training actually helps those individuals the most. One large series of studies done by Philip Tetlock, this individual who wrote this book here, shows that you can actually train people to be better at estimating and forecasting things. And interestingly, he showed the kinds of teams that would measurably outperform other teams. Those teams need to be comprised of individuals who he called belief updaters. These are people who are willing to change their positions based on new information. This is apparently not a universal human trait. There's a lot of people that when they're challenged will double down on their initial beliefs no matter what you tell them. But Tetlock showed that you can be trained to be much better at subjectively assessing your uncertainty and get better at forecasting the future. So it's something that you can be trained to get a little bit better at. Now, there's also a series of research studies that showed that there's ways we could aggregate the estimates of multiple experts. And some of these aggregation methods measurably outperform others. Perhaps the most common one is just getting everybody in a room and building a consensus. That's probably also the worst performing, according to all the research. There's algorithms for combining people, though, that measurably outperform even the best individuals. You might have heard the wisdom of crowds approach, where you just average everybody's estimates. That's an algorithmic approach. That's a very simple algorithm, but it's not the best algorithm. There's better algorithms than just averaging everybody. They're based in part on their previous performance at estimating things, but it also takes into account that knowledge is often slightly complementary, that two heads are better than even two individual people. Two adds up to more than two in that case. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts when it comes to combining knowledge. This is mathematically correct. The math behind this actually agrees with what we observe empirically. You may have seen me speak last time when I talked about one of the expert aggregation methods we've been testing for a while. It's a method for combining the estimates of multiple independent Smees. We call it Franken Smee. And we get very good results. We've had over 2,000 people go through our calibration training where we train people to get better at subjectively assessing probabilities. We took 577 of those most recent participants in the training. And for those 577 individuals, there were over 60,000 individual responses to questions that those 577 people provided. And we put those people together into groups of teams, actually millions of teams that we created. We called them virtual teams. 1.7 million were just teams of 3 people. So in other words, we would take people who didn't know each other and we'd make a team out of them when they were answering the same question. And we would ask, given this combination of responses from these 3 people who don't know each other, what's the chance that this statement is true? Okay, so we'd give them true false statements and they'd put a probability on that statement being true. Okay, these are various trivia questions. I should also tell you that we've already done controlled experiments that show that training even with trivia questions actually helps people get better at subjectively assessing their uncertainty on real-world tasks that they have to do. So it's a general skill that can be taught, actually. So if we look at these 1.7 million virtual teams of 3 people, we would find lots of teams where one person said something was 40% likely, one said 60%, and one said 70%. Given that information, what's the chance that the statement is true? What about when someone says it's 5% likely, another person says 20%, another person says 50%? Again, what's the chance that the statement has of being true? What we find is that you don't just take the average. There's a nonlinear relationship here because knowledge is at least slightly complementary. On this chart, I'm showing the horizontal axis is what the Smee algorithm predicts the chance of being correct is, the chance that the statement is true based on the expert inputs. And the vertical axis is how often that group was actually a true statement. Okay, so here's one particular bubble right here. The size of the bubbles represents how many individual estimates were in that particular group. Okay, so there's apparently 2,343 cases where 3 individuals all said something was 70% likely to be true. Now, again, these are people who don't know each other. We just put them in the same virtual team. But if 3 people independently said something was 70% likely to be true, it turns out that it's more than 70% likely to be true. Okay? The algorithm said it had about an 83.5% chance of being true. And the observed actuals, when we look at the empirical data, was 82.3. It seems odd that that should be the case, but it actually makes perfect sense mathematically. Again, it's because their knowledge is slightly complementary. They're looking at it from different perspectives, and when 3 people all agree without communicating with each other, and they're all pointing in the same direction, that thing is more likely than any one of them alone seem to believe. Okay. So that's called Smee, and that's something we've been experimenting with for a while. Now, group inconsistency, group performance, individual training, the effects that the dashboards have on decision making, etc. Those are all things that we could track. We just need to start to track them. You probably make a lot of estimates, more than you remember making. The problem is that you are more likely to remember when you were right than when you were wrong. You just tend to forget all the times you were wrong more often than you forget the times that you were right. That's why we all remember being great forecasters. That's one of the sources of overconfidence, is we're more likely to remember when we're right. So how do we combat this? Well, I guess I was partly influenced by some work I did with the American Statistical Association. Back in 2017, I was on their organizing committee for the ASA Symposium on Statistical Inference. This was about basically redesigning scientific method to get past methods that have been around for basically a century now. We wanted to improve on those methods. The area is called meta-science. That's the name of the field where we apply scientific method to science itself. Meta-science is the application of scientific method to itself to continuously improve that field. One of the issues it addresses is publication bias. that happens when researchers conduct an experiment, but they don't get anything interesting in the experiment, so they don't publish it. So they only end up publishing things that have interesting results. Well, that creates a bias in the findings. If you only publish 1 in 20 experiments, well, then the chance that the ones you do publish are a random fluke are higher because you just happen to be publishing the things that are positive in the first place. It's not an intentional error that's introduced by researchers, but it is an error. It's a source of error. So one of the ways that people were thinking of combating this is something that they called the research registry, and that's something that we promoted in the article I wrote in the American Statistician. I was also an associate editor on that issue, and I wrote an article or co-authored an article about applying particular Bayesian methods to statistical inference methods used in science. So one of the ideas that we promoted that would make this practical is this research registry. The idea is that you would register all the research that you would conduct, regardless of what the findings would be. You registered it in advance, and regardless of what the findings were, we know that you at least conducted the experiment. That way, everything is being recorded, regardless of whether or not it was just a positive finding or not. So it's going to help alleviate things like publication bias. But there is an equivalent to publication bias in decision making. That's where you only recall some of the estimates and some of the decisions that you ever made. So how do we combat that? Really, with the same method. We have to register our estimates and decisions a little bit more systematically. Now, we've been doing this for a while, actually. We've been developing more methods along these lines, but we already train or calibrate a lot of our clients with online methods, and we track their calibration approach. We track their performance on calibration, and then we also record and track their estimates on a variety of estimation problems, so they can be assigned estimation problems as individuals or as teams. Remember, we're applying the Frank and Smee algorithms here for the teams, and then we observe the results. There's going to be plenty of data in your organization if you start tracking something like this, if you just start recording all the things you actually estimate, which the vast majority of you've never actually recorded. That's why you have far more estimates than you recall making. You're just not writing them all down. So you start tracking as many as you can so that you can start getting feedback relatively early. You're going to start tracking the performance of individual subject matter experts, but also the performance of the teams they're put in. Remember, the sum of the individuals is not the same as the performance of the whole team. This is really interesting here. So we find counterintuitive results, like, for example, the best team may not just be your best estimators. It should be a team of people who are at least slightly uncorrelated with each other, and yet sometimes agree. In those cases, those things are much more likely to be true. It's counterintuitive, but it's completely consistent with the math, actually. Now, let me get into something that's a little bit more aspirational, because this is the one thing I've mentioned so far that we haven't actually implemented in the real world. Okay, so everything else I've talked about up to right now are things we've used on many clients at many projects over the years. So these are all well-worn methods, actually. But now I want to talk about a couple of new things that we haven't tried yet, but we started some discussions about this, and I'm kind of interested to see how it might turn out. My third book included the topic of computational social science. It deals with how social networks influence and spread behavior. So there were a couple of research that did a lot of interesting work in this space, where they observed how things like depression and behavior and health and so forth spread through a network, kind of like a virus, right? So certain behaviors and preferences and influences can be tracked through a network. And by tweaking networks a little bit, you can find that you might change your health, for example. You might change your depression just by nudging the kinds of connections that you're making. Maybe one additional introduction might cause you to increase your performance in some particular area. Well, we know that often putting people together into teams to be better estimators or better decision makers is not necessarily very obvious. Sometimes it's an unusual combination of individuals that make the best estimators or teams of decision makers. Now, if you could try to predict what that might be by watching people's social behavior. And people, by the way, volunteer their social behavior here. I'm not talking about eavesdropping or anything. This is actually just looking at the behavior they volunteer. This is a lot of what my third book was about. Now, again, this is not something I've implemented personally, but you know that Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and so forth all use your social network behavior to optimize their platforms. They use that to get you to be more engaged with their platforms, to spend more time on their platforms. Well, you could probably use that in a more beneficial way for yourself as well. What if you could find out through some analytics of your social networks that spending more time with certain people, at certain colleagues, or having certain discussions, or changing your lunch group or something like this would actually make you perform better at something? There's some interesting research that indicates this might be possible. Now, I would consider this part of, well, obviously a more aspirational goal of integrated decision management, but it is part of integrated decision management. We're talking about improving the performance of decision making as a whole, bringing together all those disparate kinds of methods and fields, and talking about how we actually measure their performance. Because I could tell you one thing I never see on a dashboard is a metric that tracks the ROI of a dashboard. What if we had that on the dashboard? What if right on the dashboard we had the information value of the dashboard? And it covered all these different topics: computational social science, how well your network is performing, how well your team is performing, how well this group of individuals perform at estimating the cost of IT projects or the risk of cybersecurity events, etc. All right. So that's a little bit sci-fi, I understand. But if we look at, again, at just trying to summarize this decision ecosystem, I think there are lots of practical components here. There are several components here that we already know how to do. We can track and train subject matter experts. We know how to compare their observed outcomes to the individual estimates they originally gave. We know how to aggregate them mathematically. We know how to test the performance of models. We know which kinds of methods, based on external research, in other words, published academic research, clinical trial research, we know which methods measurably outperform others, and we've got lots of neat methods for empirical measurements, okay? And all of those feed decisions. But within the context of that, I think we can eventually start to add things like, how well do individuals do based on measures of fatigue or stress or the time of day, etc.? What if we could fine-tune our performance at that level? Now, this is this can be entirely voluntary. This is strictly for people who want to be involved in something like this. But I personally, at least parts of this are something I would be willing to do. There's lots of areas where I would love to see how my performance would evolve if only I could network better or measure something a little differently, etc. All right, so let me summarize all of this. First, think of risk management as a component of a larger decision-making process, not as a separate thing or a separate goal by itself. It's part of decision-making. Getting the most value out of risk management is probably going to involve developing the other components of decision-making so that you can connect with them a little bit better, all right? So there's decisions under uncertainty, which risk assessment and risk management are part of. One of the first steps to making that connection is starting to track the performance of subject matter experts, decision makers, and models. Don't assume they work. Be a skeptic, even of the models that you build. Constantly ask, how do I know this works? That brings me to the end of my session. Feel free to contact me at dwhubbard@hubbardresearch.com if you have any questions. I'm very interested in seeing where some of these concepts might go, so I'm looking forward to developing these ideas further with anybody who is interested. Thanks.